Oh, but we got live feed too. And right now they're just reading my lips. So we'll do a big we'll be forever. How about now? How about now? Am I on now? I'm on through there. Hello. They can't hear me? Okay. So we'll go ahead and go. As long as you guys can hear me okay? I really don't have any doubt. Who's that? Oh, that's me. I I don't want to see that. Okay. Cool. All right, so welcome to Wednesday night, the passage. And so tonight we're in the book of Numbers. We just finished up Leviticus last week. We took a couple of weeks to look at Leviticus. And just let me ask the people who are here, what stood out to you about Leviticus? I mean, was there anything in particular that stood out to you about Leviticus? The haircut, okay. That the Levites couldn't, actually the men could not shave the sideburns and part of their hair. And to this day, there's a couple of people. Yeah, you don't shave, do you? And I hate to. Actually, I was just talking to Chelsea and Tim before everything started, and I was talking about. We were actually talking about Buddy Holly and the Big Bopper and Ricky Valance and the fact, when they were killed. And Chelsea made the comment that they look so much older. And I just told her that as a senior in high school, I kind of looked a little older too. I could grow a good mustache and I could grow a pretty good beard. And so, but I grew up in a family that basically my granddad told me, you shave. You are supposed to be clean shaven. And so I had to do that all the time, and I did get to rebel one time my senior year for football because we all grew our hair and didn't shave, and we were a pathetic looking group of guys. But anyway, so that stood out to you. All right, anything else? Sure. Yeah, I mean, if you messed up, you know, a lot of butchering of animals, a lot of blood.
Imagine if that was today, there wouldn't be any animals left.
I know. Well, no, there wouldn't. Yeah. So, but yeah, and I think I shared during that time that I had the opportunity in seminary, or I had a job in a butcher shop, or processing plant, which is just a nice way of saying a slaughterhouse. So, but I worked there for about 3.5, 4 years, and so I got a whole new appreciation for what Joe was talking about, all the ritual stuff. I mean, the actual presence of how much blood that produces, and it's incredible. So that stood out. Anything else stand out to anyone else about the book of Leviticus? All right, so now we come to, what's that? Oh, about the tattoos? Yeah. I don't like that passage. I'm just kidding. It actually doesn't really apply to people today. It applied specifically to the Israelites. They weren't to follow practices of the nations around them. So anyway, we're in the book of Numbers tonight. And this is going to be kind of just an introduction to the book. Next week, we'll look at some stuff. I don't, anybody get a chance to, I mean, even at home, if you want to answer, to the live chat and stuff, anybody get a chance to kind of peruse the book before we came in tonight? Did you look at it a little bit? Okay. So what do you think? What was your observation?
There was a lot of fighting.
All right.
War.
All right.
Taking a lot of land.
Okay. All right.
Completely wiping it out.
Okay. All right. Here's what I observed. Previously, when you think of the book of Numbers, because the book of Numbers is actually named for the Lord's instruction to Moses to number or count, according to chapter 1, verse 3, he was to count every male who was of military age. Okay? And so that's what it's named for. 2 times in the book he does this. In chapter 1, through the first few chapters, if you're reading that and you kind of think that's all that this book is going to be, what do you want to do? Huh?
Skip it.
Hey, absolutely brutally honest, but it's the truth. You want to skip it, right? But there was a purpose behind it. I kind of think of whenever I was playing football, this may sound weird, but when I was playing football, if the city population was bigger than our city population, I kind of thought that the opponents there were going to be a little bit tougher. Now, that proved not to be true sometimes, but that's kind of what was in my mind. We had Salem was a community of about 7,800, 7,600 when I was going to school. And we would, now, a little misleading because Salem had that population, but our high school was called a community high school, which kind of brought in, it was kind of like a county high school, all right? So we had quite a number of students in our school. But if we were playing somebody like Centralia, which had a population of about 14,000 or 15,000, I kind of had the thought that they were going to be tougher than we were, right? And so Moses, I don't know that that's the inspiration for this, but Moses was told to number the males who were of military age. And so he did that in chapter 1, and then 40 years later, he does it again in chapter 26 of the book of Numbers. And so you have the book named Numbers because that's the instruction that God gives Moses, is to count the number of military males. All right? And then what you've got to understand is between those 2 times that he does it is the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. And so the book of Numbers, as I went back and began to investigate it, has a whole lot more to offer than just the genealogies and the census taking that Moses did. And so this book also records the Israelites' faithful experiences, and there were some of them, and then their not so faithful moments, rebellions. Robin talked about how there was a lot of fighting, and there was even fighting amongst themselves. And so this book records, some of those sorts of things. And so for 40 years they wander in the wilderness, and they have some faithful experiences, and they have some not so faithful moments. And so as students of the Bible, this book actually offers lessons in how we can trust and obey the Lord, and then also sustain His chosen leaders. Okay? And my question, one of my questions tonight is, how well do we actually do that? How well do we actually sustain those that God has chosen to lead us? Personally, I think it's a timely question because we're preparing for another presidential election. And so, again, the question is, what do you think I mean by sustaining His chosen leaders? What do you think part of that is? Putting it in today's perspective. Do what? Supporting them. Okay. How do we support them?
I think by first figuring out who God's chosen leaders are to begin with.
All right. So that's kind of, Dustin just said, by first figuring out who God's chosen leaders are. How do you suppose we figure that out? Don't be shy. Huh? Okay. All right, they tell you. We have to believe them. Well, let's talk a little bit about both. Let's start with the church, okay? How do they prove that they are God's chosen leaders within the church? How they gain the position? All right. So let's use the elders. All right. That Robin, I mean, he just simplified it. When you find people who follow the book, and so let's go back to the elders. They are to be men, all right, who are married to one wife at a time. Okay, that's an important distinction because, it was really more about a problem with polygamy that was going on. And I'm not saying that, again, they had to have believing families, right? So they proved leadership at home. Did somebody just take my picture? I thought I saw a flash over there. So, oh, that was that? Okay. Tommy, quit that. Okay. All right. So anyway, they follow the book. And so with preachers and teachers, Sunday school teachers, road group leaders, which is what we call our small groups here, they demonstrate that they're following the book, and that's why you can trust them. The Apostle Paul said, and I'm not quite so bold to quote for myself what Paul said, but Paul said, you follow me because I follow Christ. Okay? And so that's how we choose them within the church. But what about in the world, okay? The political world, and let's be kind and gentle about this. But what about in the political world? How do you think that they're chosen or put into the positions by God?
I think too many people put emphasis on their personalities. I think you should look at the issues.
Okay.
And if the issues that they are platforming on are the closest to morality,
Okay.
then as Christians, I think it's our duty to support and elect those people.
All right, but suppose the one that we vote against is in office. What is our responsibility then? To pray for them. And okay. Right. Paul writes and says that our responsibility is to pray. Now you got to put yourself in his setting, right? The person that he's saying that you should pray for is the one who executed him, right? And so, I mean, I'm sorry, but that's kind of hard news for the church sometimes to hear those things. Because sometimes the person who is in office directly opposes what we may stand for, at least partially. You heard me say this before, and I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this because we're talking about the book of Numbers. But yet, there's a great example that we're going to look at in just a second. God puts men and women in those positions, right? And Paul says our responsibility is to pray for them, not to complain about them. Now, let me just say this. That doesn't mean you agree with everything that they stand for. Our responsibility is to pray for them. You know why? And I've shared this before, because when we pray in the Spirit to God, then God attempts to communicate with that leader our desire, his desire for that leader to follow his direction. Unfortunately, they don't always do that. And the truth is, if we come back to the church, there are preachers who don't always do that, and there are leaders who don't always do that. Make them be accountable. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, and please hear me carefully, because I still believe that we live, in could be the greatest country that has ever existed. But unfortunately, sometimes what we've done as the church is we've basically looked at democracy and we said, God chooses democracy. And he really doesn't. He doesn't, the Bible says he's not a respecter of any nation. Now, be careful with that because he does, he does love us as individuals. I'm getting ready to do a series on the names of God, and one of the names that we're going to look at is Abba. Jesus taught his disciples to pray, Abba, Father, Daddy. And it literally means daddy or papa. Or papa, not papa, but papa. And so the point being is that God deeply loves us as individuals. He loves his church. My goodness, why would he use the analogy that Jesus is the bridegroom and we are the bride if he doesn't deeply love his church? But when it comes to the nations, he is not a respecter of nations. Democracy, tyranny, any of them, he's not a respecter of them. He respects obedience to his direction. And I think it was said, do they keep their word? And so often, isn't that what we experience? So often with elected officials or whoever it might be. And by the way, I'm not saying they're all like that, but my goodness. And you know this. How many times in your lifetime have we kind of been burned by them? And you know why? Because they're men. They're men, okay? So now, let's come back to an example here in the book of Numbers of sustaining leaders. If you turn to chapter 12, we're going to look at just a few verses. It says that Miriam and Aaron began to talk against Moses because of his Cushite wife, for he had married a Cushite. And so a Cushite, you need to understand that a Cushite woman or man was probably black. And so Miriam and Aaron began to speak. Now, is this Zipporah? It's possible that it is Zipporah. Other people disagree with that, and they say that Moses married another woman. And so I kind of support the idea that it's Zipporah, that that's who she is. And so they speak against Moses because of it. And then look what they say. Has the Lord spoken only through Moses, they asked? Hasn't he also spoken through us? And the Lord heard this. Now Moses, notice the parenthetical note. I'll talk about that in a minute. Now Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth. That is, until a man and a God named Jesus came. Then Moses took second. Okay? And so Moses is said to be the most humble man on earth. At once the Lord said to Moses, Aaron and Miriam, come out to the tent of meeting, all three of you. So the three of them came out, and then the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud. He stood at the entrance to the tent and summoned Aaron and Miriam. When both of them stepped forward, he said, listen to my words. When a prophet of the Lord is among you, I reveal myself to him in visions. I speak to him in dreams. But this is not true of my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak face to face, clearly and not in riddles. He sees the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? And then what happens is God demonstrates to Miriam and Aaron how he could punish them. God ultimately has grace upon them. But I will say this. This is the reason that Aaron and Miriam are not allowed to enter into the promised land. Because they basically spoke against God's chosen leader. And again, I just come back to it. And it's not, please don't hear me as being quite this serious. But isn't it possible that sometimes we've done the same thing? And I'm not talking about someone criticizing me, okay? It actually may be applicable in a couple of situations, but not in general. But think about our responsibility that Paul says to pray for the leaders that God has. Can I just say this? You may not like the fact that he's placed them there, but he has allowed them to be in that position. And so we have a responsibility to pray for them and not to curse them. And I don't know anyone here who curses them. I know a lot of people, including me, who may disagree with their actions, their motives, or whatever it may be. But we have a greater responsibility as the people of God to actually lift them up in prayer. And I think a big part of that is that we need to learn that prayer actually does change things if we could really focus on those leaders. And so you can kind of read the rest of the story later on, but it's an interesting place where God steps in and says, hey, don't speak against him. And it ends up being the people who are closest to him, if you notice. All right, so now, why study the book of Numbers? Those are some of the reasons. It teaches us some pretty valuable lessons. And there's a whole lot more stuff in there that we'll look at next week. We're actually going to look at some of the specific stories. So who wrote this book? Well, Moses is the author of the book. It's pretty much from what we call internal evidence. It kind of says that he does, all right? He was called by the Lord to lead the children of Israel out of bondage in Egypt through the wilderness to the promised land of Canaan. And so Moses was an eyewitness to most of the stuff. I mean, including, you saw that when God is dealing with Miriam and Aaron, Moses is present. And so he sees the experience. He knows the story. And so he's an eyewitness to most of the events recorded in the book. But there are some occasions and events that must have been shared with him by other witnesses, such as the interactions between Balaam and Balak, Numbers 22 through 24. If I were assigning reading for next week, that would be a great section for you to read. The exchange between Balaam and Balak. Now, I'll tell you that Balak is the king of Moab, and Balaam, actually I'll leave that to you. Come back next week and tell me whether you think Balaam is a prophet of God or if he's a sorcerer. Okay? If you can remember that. Come back and tell me. Did you have your... What's that? Oh, Numbers 22 through 24. Well, we'll get to that. That story is in this book, okay, of why Moses can't enter in to the promised land as well. All right, so Numbers 22 through 24, if you get a chance to read that, that would be great. And then tell me whether you think Balaam is a prophet or if he is a sorcerer, okay? All right, so now in addition, there are some alterations that may have taken place by scribes. We're talking about who wrote the book. Remember, Moses wrote the book. But a great example we just read. Remember when I told you pay attention to the parenthetical, the parentheses in verse 3? Moses didn't write that about himself, okay? What's the old Mac Davis song? Oh, Lord, it's hard to be humble when you're perfect in every way, right? And so Moses didn't write those words about himself. Somebody else did. And it could have been a scribe later on, or it could have been Joshua. If you remember, when Moses dies, Joshua is the one who's given command. And so Joshua may have come back and wrote that Moses was a very humble man, the most humble man that had ever lived. And so that's kind of an example that there are some of those things in here that may have been added. And that, hey, listen, a lot of people look at that and they go, well, then, is the Bible perfect? Well, yeah, I mean, it is. It is perfect. And if I were to quote that Mac Davis song again, I would say, it's perfect in every way, right? And so it is, it's perfect. And so the addition must have been something that God wanted to have there. All right, so when and where was it written? There's actually a lot of opinions as to when the book of Numbers and the other books of Moses were written. Just a little quiz here. What are the other books of Moses? Hurry, because someone at home is beating you to the response. What are the other books of Moses? What? All right. The first 5 books of the Bible were written by Moses. And so Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. And Pam had that, but she was a little quiet. She had it. So the first 5 books of the Bible are attributed to Moses. But we don't have the exact date for the writings. But one of the things that we know, the text provides information to the setting of the writing of the book. For example, Numbers 1:1 through 10:10 records the events that occurred before Moses and the nation of Israel left Mount Sinai. They camped there for 1 year. Okay? Almost 1 year to the day, 1 year to the day from when they left Egypt. Okay, so chapter 1 through chapter 10:10 records that. All the stuff that happens near Mount Sinai. And then Israel's experiences in the wilderness are found in Numbers 10:11 through chapter 21, verse 35. And so what you'll have in there are things like the 12 spies being sent out. All right? And then you'll have Korah's rebellion, all that kind of information. By the way, those are the things that we're specifically going to look at next week. And so we're going to tell some of the stories next week. And then Numbers 22 through chapter 36 relates events that occurred as the Israelites camped on the plains of Moab. They had arrived where they needed to be. It's actually near Jericho. They're preparing to go into the land of Canaan. And so 22 through 36 is about that preparation. Now there's some distinctive features in the book. The book of Numbers provides census information that shares the size of the population of Israel at the beginning and at the end of their wilderness wandering. And so, that's important because at the beginning, there's a whole generation that is going to perish out in the wilderness, okay? And a new generation takes over. It also outlines the organization of the camp of Israel, which is kind of interesting because they kind of put some of the weaker tribes towards the middle, stronger tribes on the outside. Now, why would they do that? For protection, right? So there's stuff in there like that. It discusses the responsibilities of the Levites. Who are the Levites? They took care of the tabernacle, the grounds, everything. On the Day of Atonement, one of them was elected to take the scapegoat out of the camp. On the Day of Atonement, one of them was elected to take all of the offal. That's what it's called, the blood and anything that was left over of the sacrifices. They were elected to take it outside the camp to burn it. And you remember then they had to purify themselves, wash their clothes, wash themselves, and then come back in. And it also explains the Nazirite vow. The conditions of the Nazirite vow. Can you name, let's just do this. Can anybody name 2 people from the New Testament who had taken the Nazirite vow? John the Baptist? All right. No. John the Baptist, and then it's kind of a trick question, but and then possibly the Apostle Paul. Were you going to say that? All right. You said it? Well, you would have been correct, because there was an occasion when he shaved his head, and that sometimes is the beginning of the Nazirite vow. We don't know specifically if that's the vow he took. We are told he took a vow, and he shaved his head, and then he allowed his hair to begin to grow back. So the Apostle Paul possibly, but definitely John the Baptist. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about that next week. Numbers also records the instances when Israel rebelled against God and Moses. And these brought some pretty severe consequences upon themselves. One example is in chapter 16, and we'll look at it specifically next week, but if you want to turn over, it's called Korah's Rebellion. Korah stirs up a bunch of people. Isn't it interesting? And I'm just talking about this kind of thing, but tonight there's no specific thought that I have. But part of it came from a study that I had with three guys out at Second. I go out there every Tuesday morning, and it's our CR group. I'm not ashamed to tell you that. It's Celebrate Recovery. And so I go out there, and I have an accountability group, and I'm going through the steps. And so we were talking about accountability, and we were talking about confidentiality. And we were talking about that if you have an issue with someone, what should you do? Talk to that person, right? We should talk to that person. And if they're willing, you sometimes find that they're not willing, but we should talk to that person. Instead, sometimes what we do is we talk to each other, right? And so that's kind of what I look at Korah as doing. Korah starts talking to people. And in fact, let me just kind of share with you today. I went out to see Dan Huffine because Dan has officially been put on the hospice list because things are progressing. And so Dan was kind of bummed out about that. He knew it was coming, but when I got out there, I just told him, here's the thing. You got the news a little sooner than you thought you were going to get it. You knew the news was coming, but you got it a little sooner. And what that does is it's a whole new reality, right? And it worries us. But anyway, I was talking with him, and he brought up a name of someone and said, it's strange. He said, how is your relationship with that person? And I said, well, it's not very good. And so he said, what can be done to make it right? And here's what I said. He needs to apologize and he needs to repent. And Dan was like, so from your side? I said, from my side, I honestly don't have any animosity towards him. What he said about me, what he has done, because there were some things that he did. And so here's how I proved to Dan and Ramona that I don't have any animosity. I didn't tell them what he'd done. See, if I tell them what he'd done, or if I told them what he said about me, then I'm coloring their judgment of him, and I don't need to do that. And so I can hold firmly to the fact that if he were to come and apologize and repent, I'm going to embrace him as my brother in Christ. And so that's kind of a cool place to be, because I've not always been like that, if you know what I mean. Sometimes when people say things about you, you want to say things back, right? Well, let me tell you what they did, right? And so Korah's rebellion, I kind of look at it that way, that Korah, for some reason, is not satisfied with what's going on. And so rather than just giving his opinion, he begins to shape other people's opinions. And so that's a part of that cause, and we'll look at it specifically next week in chapter 16. And then there's the poor judgment of Moses in Numbers chapter 20. And again, I'll go in detail. But basically what Moses does is he doesn't listen to what God tells him. Yeah, absolutely. Because God told him one thing and he did. You know, and the interesting thing is, let me just kind of talk about it just a minute, because I preached this. I was given this assignment years ago when I was on staff at Lincoln. And J.K. Jones came to me and said, I want you to preach in Numbers chapter 20. In Numbers chapter 20. And here's the title that I'm giving you. Leading Outside the Lines. Okay? Because would you agree, Dennis, if you know the story, that Moses stepped outside the lines, right? Clearly did. Because earlier he is told to bring water forth from the rock, and he's told to go to this rock and strike it with his staff. And he does that. He speaks to it and says, bring forth water. And God brings forth water. Well, in chapter 20, Moses is told to speak to the rock. And he gets to the rock, and he's so frustrated with the people of Israel that he strikes the rock. He strikes it twice. And he says, if I remember right, he strikes it twice and he says, must we bring water forth from this rock? And so not only did he disobey God, but he stepped into God's position. You know, I used an illustration that night from Hoosiers. How many of you guys, have you all seen Hoosiers? You know the movie I'm talking about. And I used the scene where they're in foul trouble, and this kid that he's benched automatically thinks he's going back in the game. And Gene Hackman, I can't remember the coach's name, but Gene Hackman stops him and says, where are you going? He goes, I'm going in the game. He goes, sit down. So he sits him down. The official comes over and says, Coach, we got 4 on the floor. We need 1 more. And Gene Hackman says, unforgettable words, my team is on the floor, leading outside the lines. You know, he was different. Now, you come back to Moses' example, it's different for a reason, because he's disobedient and he puts himself in God's place. But you know the cool thing about that story? What happens? I mean, don't jump to Moses' punishment yet. But what happens when Moses disobeys God and strikes the rock instead of speaking to it? And then he takes credit for what's about to happen. But what happens? What? God provided still. He still brought the water. Isn't that cool? I mean, to me, that is absolutely amazing of God. That someone just stepped outside the lines of obedience and he still provides. What? God, he does. He does. And he promised water, so he brought forth water. Now, because of it, Moses, in his poor judgment, in his disobedience, in his stepping into God's position, Moses has to receive punishment. And the punishment that God chooses is, I will let you see the promised land, but you may not enter. And so because of that, there's only 2 of that generation who are able to enter into the promised land. Joshua and Caleb. You know, and so that's another part. That's one of the distinctive things about the book of Numbers, and we'll look at some other things like that. Besides illustrating God's divine justice. By the way, and I'm not trying to spoil the story, but back to Korah's rebellion. What happens to the people who rebel? Anybody remember? Huh? Yeah, but how'd they die? The earth opened up and swallowed them. And I'm not sure if that's true of all 24,000. And in fairness, I mean, Jeff's looking right now, but in fairness, that probably needs to be confirmed. It may just be part of what I remember about another story. But I believe that the earth opens up and swallows Korah and some of the others. Okay? Anyway, all of this is to illustrate the fact that the book of Numbers is not just about genealogies and numbers. Okay? There's some, can I say this without anybody misunderstanding it? Because there's a lot of tragedy, but there's some pretty cool stuff that goes on in the book of Numbers. Okay? And so then there's the incident with the brass serpent. A lot of people began to disobey. God allows snakes, poisonous snakes, to enter the camp. They bite people, and people are dying. And then Moses is instructed to put up a brass serpent, a brazen serpent. And if people look at that serpent, then they are healed. And so that's an important illustration. Because in John chapter 3, Jesus says, just as the brass serpent was lifted up in the desert, so the Son of Man must be lifted up. And because of that, men will be drawn to him. You know, it's because of his sacrifice, his love, God's grace and mercy, and we are drawn to him. All right, so a quick outline of the book of Numbers. And I know we're just kind of going through some things tonight, and again, trying to keep an outline interesting, okay? But the outline of the book of Numbers chapter 1 through chapter 9. Moses and other leaders record the number of military-aged males in the tribes, and the total was 603,500 men, fighting men. And those numbers do not include the males from the tribe of Levi for a reason. The Lord designates how the tribes will camp in the wilderness, and that's for their protection and their strength. He describes the Nazirite vow in chapters 1 through 9. That's there. And then the second Passover is held to commemorate the Lord's deliverance of the Israelites from bondage in Egypt. And so that's all in chapters 1 through 9. Okay? So think about that. It had been a year, and they celebrate the Passover. You think it brought back some memories of that night coming out of Egypt, about being cornered by the Red Sea and by crossing over? That's exactly what the Israelites were to remember year by year by year. And so the second Passover is held. And then Numbers chapter 10, verse 11 through 22, chapter 22, the Israelites leave their encampment at Mount Sinai, and they continue their journey toward the Promised Land. Just again, a little quiz of things we've talked about. Who was the land promised to? Abraham. Chapter 12 of Genesis, Abraham is told by God, I will make you a nation, I will give you a land, and your seed will be a blessing to all seeds. Nation, land, and blessing. I know I repeat that a lot, but it's important. The more you repeat something, the better you remember it. And so Abraham is promised nation, land, and blessing. Two of the promises are being made true here. They become a nation. They became a nation when they received the law. And now they're headed for the Promised Land. They get there and they send 12 spies into the land of Canaan. And so 12 spies go. What do they see? What do they describe when they come back? What was that? A land flowing with milk and honey. They said the vegetation there was huge, you know. And so, but what else? Okay, so two of them give a pretty positive report. But then there's 10, and what do the 10 get hung up on?
Large people to fight.
They got giants there. They have giants, And so the people, the Israelites, are afraid to enter into the land. The way is going to be tough. The way is going to be hard. And so they're afraid to enter into the land. And so God is displeased with Israel, and he announces that they will wander in the desert wilderness until that unbelieving generation was dead. And so that's the 40 years in the wilderness. In their wandering, the Israelites face a variety of trials, and they continue to complain. Can I just say something about the church? That's the one thing I wish we could change in the church. Man, there are going to be things you disagree with. There are going to be things that happen. And if we could just stop complaining. Stop complaining. It still happens today. So then Moses, in those chapters, Moses is disobedient, loses his right to enter into the promised land. The brass serpent is raised as a remedy to those who were bitten by snakes. And so all of that happens in those chapters. Chapters 22 through 36. The Israelites pitch their tents on the plains of Moab. They camp on the plains of Moab. And some kings in that area fear their presence, and one in particular was Balak. And so Balak comes to Balaam to curse Israel. And Balaam refuses to curse them. Instead, what he does is he offers a blessing upon the nation of Israel. And yet, some of the Israelites, in fact, some preachers, and I'm looking for this passage in here, so if any of you find it, you can help me out with that. But I've searched the scriptures, but some preachers have said that Balaam told Balak, hey, if you really want to get Israel, here's what you need to do. You need to have your women seduce the men. And the problem with that is that as the women began, and that happened, some of the Israelites actually began to have sexual relations with the daughters of Moab, and they began to worship Baal. They began to worship a false god. And so God punishes those who rebelled against his direction. I mean, let me just tell you one of the interesting things in that story is that Moses goes to the head of the tribes. This is kind of R-rated stuff, okay? I mean, it's tough stuff. Because Moses goes to the head of the tribes and the clans and says, if any of your relatives are doing this, you need to kill them. That's how serious God was about keeping the camp clean. Okay? And keeping the nation of Israel clean from the outside nations. And I know this is kind of dry material, but doesn't that stir something in you? That God would actually ask the fathers, the grandfathers, to kill their own children or grandchildren if they are committing sin. And so that's what God orders Moses to state. So the older generation passes away, and the new generation is ready to enter the promised land. And so, I thought about that a lot. I thought, even in the church, we still sometimes have generational differences, right? And young people come on, and young people always generally think that they can do better, right? I mean, if you're honest, you know that's true. You've thought it. You've been there, perhaps. When the way that it should work and does work sometimes is that the older generation teaches the younger generation. And yet sometimes we see this friction that perhaps they had in the nation of Israel. And then finally, the Lord gives instructions about lands, boundaries, and cities there in the Promised Land. So that's the book of Numbers, or at least an introduction to it. Again, I'll say when I went back and looked at it, because I'll tell you the truth, as I remembered it, it was a lot more of the lines about generations and genealogies and things. But there's a whole lot of stuff in between. Okay? So 40 years of wandering. Let's kind of close with talking about that a little bit. What do you think that was? I mean, just from hearing it referred to, what do you think that was like? 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. All right. Yeah. Yeah. It would be like today, yeah, it'd be like today going somewhere and putting up a tent and calling that your home, Hey, let me tell you a quick story kind of along that line. People, they were nomadic. Even though it's a little bit of a misunderstood, the wandering in the wilderness. It might surprise you to know that they camped for 38 years in one location. For 38 of the 40 years, they were in one location. However, they had to still, if they had cattle and sheep and that sort of thing, they still had to find places to feed them, and it led to conflicts sometimes. Real quick, that nomadic kind of lifestyle. Some people can do it, and some people can't. Okay? I just last Wednesday, before we left the church between our office hours and this 6 o'clock time. So a couple of you have heard this story, so bear with me. But we got a phone call, and Chelsea, I love this. Chelsea buzzed me and said, "Can you take this one, please?" And so I answered the phone, and this guy says, "Hey, do you ever help with bus tickets? You ever help with bus tickets someplace?" And I said, "Yeah, we have in the past." And I said, "Where do you want to go?" And he said, "Denver." And I said, "Where are you at now?" And he said, "Waynestown, Indiana." And I'm walking. And so he said, "According to Google Earth, I'm about an hour and a half away from you." I said, "Not if you're walking." Chelsea did 10 hours and 36 minutes? So I told him, I said, "You're 10 hours and 36 minutes from Danville." He goes, "Wow." So I said, what were you doing in Kentucky? Because he said he'd walking from Kentucky back to, which is a weird route to me, unless he just didn't want to go through some of the mountains and different things like that, walking. But anyway, I said, "What were you doing in Kentucky?" "Well, I was promised work by a good friend of mine, and when I got there, it all fell through. And so now I'm trying to get back home." And I could hear cars passing by him. I mean, he was walking. And so anyway, I said, "Well, how did you get to Kentucky?" He said, "Greyhound bus." And he said, "That's how I want to go home." And so anyway, talked to him a little bit more. So I said, "Hey, he goes, I want to go to the bus station there in Danville." Now, that's kind of laughable. Does anybody know what our bus station actually is? Yeah, it's a gas station, liquor store, right? And so I said, it's out on Lynch Road. And I said, if you're coming on 136, then when you get into town, you're going to find this little bus stop. That's all it is. You can buy a ticket there, but it's not a station. Oh. I said, "Where have you been staying?" He said, "In parks. Sometimes by churches. That's where I charge my phone. If they've got an outside, outlet, I charge my phone there." So anyway, I said, if you come in, you're going to find that bus station there, that bus stop. And right down the road is Second Church of Christ. Yeah, I told Greg Taylor, he laughed too, And I did that because a couple weeks ago they referred somebody to us. So I was just returning the favor. And so anyway, the guy, I just kind of forgot about it. So we're in staff meeting, and so I'm kind of about to tell a little bit of a disturbing thing, but Robbie actually had been watching or looking at the news, and I actually had seen the article too. But he comes in staff meeting, I'm telling the staff about this conversation I had with this guy, that he's really walking. I could hear that he was walking. And Robbie goes, "Did you see the article where a guy took a Greyhound bus to Kentucky with a suitcase, and when he got there, he was visiting his family, and he left the suitcase with the family, and it began to have an aroma. And so they opened the suitcase, and inside were part of the remains of his former girlfriend." True story. I mean, he's been charged, he's been caught. And so anyway, about that time, I think not long after the story, the phone rang. And Chelsea answered and said, "Hey, it's your guy." And so I get on the phone with Joe. Joe Eckelberry is his name. And so he was down by Watson's, if you know where Watson's is at. Actually, he ended up sitting at Firehouse Steakhouse, or the Firehouse Steakhouse. And he said, "I'll just be sitting there." I said, "Well, I'll come pick you up," because I said, "I will tell you this," because he said, "I can camp out somewhere." I said, "You don't want to camp out anywhere out there. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to put you up here at the Candlelight for a night, and then, because the bus only runs at 7:30 in the morning. So I said, we're going to put you up over there, and then I'm going to take you out to the bus stop and put you on the bus and send you off." And he says, "Okay." So I said, "What are you wearing?" He said, "A pair of red shorts and a 49ers pullover." And I said, "I'm sorry," because of the 49. He said, "Well, no." He said, "No, dude," because that's kind of, "No, dude, it's a cool story. A guy saw me, and it's kind of a cool day and stuff." And so he stopped and said, "You got any coat?" And he goes, "No." And he gave me this pullover. I said, "Well, that is a cool story." And so I said, "I'm sorry I made fun of your pullover." So then he says this, "And I got a suitcase." So Brian went with me, because our normal policy is that when we transport anyone, male or female, that we do so with two people. And so we went down, we got him. The guy's like 6'5", and he's, real thin. He makes his living by working for the carnival, okay? Now, the carnival, he said the carnival circuit has stopped because of COVID. But down south, they're still running some. And so I just want you to know a little bit about how he thinks. He said, "I don't want to have anything to do with those because they're kind of dirty." And so, normally it was in Colorado and Wyoming, and so he said, I've been unemployed. And so, we talked to him for a while, and we get him up here, and we put him up, and, I gave him a little bit of money because, he needed something to eat. And so anyway, I said, "I'll be here at 6:45 in the morning." He said, "Okay." And so, he said, "I'll be able to get a shower, I'll be able to shave," and by golly, he did. I got there at 6:45. He had the door open waiting on me, gets in, and we head out there. And we go in, and I knew it was $190 or something like that to go to Denver. And so the girl behind the counter, she checks the computer. And I don't, if you've ever dealt with them, they're always having trouble with their system. And so she said, "The system's down. I can't sell you a ticket." And so Joe goes, jokingly, "You know that I do not want to hear that this early in the morning." And she laughed, and he laughed. And so anyway, we waited for the bus to get there, because the next deal is I can give the money to the bus driver, and then in Burlington, Iowa, the headquarters, he will get a ticket. And so that's what the bus driver did. He pulled out his flip phone, and he called Burlington, Iowa, gave them his name. We got him the ticket. I'm telling you all this just because of the way things worked out. The bus driver turns to Joe and says, "You stick with me to Burlington, and then I'll get your ticket." So I give him $193.50, and Joe shook my hand, and then he said this: "This is the coolest thing that anybody's ever done for me." And I'm telling you, with some of the dealings that we've had lately, with people asking for help and stuff. To me, that was a refreshing thing. To deal with someone that I really believe was telling me the truth. He didn't ask for anything except for that bus ticket. And so for me, that was refreshing. And in the whole story, part of the reason I told the story is because this man kind of reminded me of what the Israelites were going through, you know. Didn't have a place. He's got a place out in Denver to call home. But for 10 days, he'd been walking and trying to get home. And he's not asking people in each town to stay in a motel. He's just camping out. He's just doing, you know, what he's longing to get home, but he's making do. And that's what I feel like the wilderness wanderings were kind of like. They're longing to get home. You know, I'm sure there were some regrets among those people. The generation that was cursed to die in the wilderness because of their grumbling, their complaining, because of their mistrust of God. In fact, they didn't have any trust in God. And so God says, fine. You know, how many times did the nation of Israel actually rise up and say, Moses, we might as well have died out here? And so God says, okay. You know, be careful what you complain about. Be careful what you grumble about, because God may just give you what you're asking for. And so, anyway, I will tell you this. I got a chance on the ride from the hotel, Candlelight, out to the station out there on Lynch Road. I got a chance to tell him, because he asked, why are you doing this? So I told him, I'm doing this because I have a Lord and a Savior who was gracious to me. And I'm doing this because I believe that you're telling me the truth. I'm doing this because you're a wanderer trying to get home. And I can tell you, and I did briefly, I said, I can tell you about the one who will fully bring you home. I've got his phone number. He's actually promised that once he gets back and he settles in, and he may have tried to call over the weekend, we just weren't here. All he has is our church number. But I have his number. And I'm really looking forward to following up with him and seeing how things are going. You know, at one time we were all wanderers, weren't we? You know, there's an old song that says, I was wandering off in sin. And then Jesus takes hold. And so that's kind of the book of Numbers. And we'll look at some of the stories next week. So bow with me. I'm about 3 minutes over. So bow with me, and at home, just bow with us and we'll pray. Father, we thank you so much for your hand of mercy and grace. And you know, one of the overlying features in this book is just how long-suffering you are, how patient you are. And Father, to think about the story of the Bible, how basically in the beginning it was paradise, and then sin entered the picture. And because you chose to give us free will so we can experience what love is, sin and evil came into it and disrupted everything. And you began to put in motion a plan. So, Father, that's part of what we're studying, the three things that you promised Moses. Two of them, one of them has already taken place in these stories, and a second one is about to come true. And then it was generations before you provided the seed of blessing. And through all of that, you have been patient with us. And so, Father, as we face some of the things we face in our country right now, the COVID virus, or the coronavirus, I should say, COVID-19, it's still frustrating people. It's still rising up, and we're experiencing it. And it's dividing people, you know. We have some people right here who are just adamant about wearing masks, and they want to battle that instead of simply looking around and considering others. I mean, we're free to make that choice. We don't have to grumble and complain about it. Father, I think of the race issue and the unity issue within the church, and it is definitely something that we have to address. But as we do so with love, because you model for us patience and long suffering, and you ask us to be like you. Father, the election that's coming up, I'm sure so many people are anxious about that. They're even anxious within. Who do I vote for? And so, Father, I pray that through the series that's coming up that we're reminded about exactly who you are. You are the Ancient of Days. You are Elohim. 32 times in the book of Genesis, first chapter of Genesis. Elohim, your name, God, Creator, Sustainer. Father, remind us that you are Yahweh, that you're a personal God. First revealed to Moses, and then he reveals it to your people. Such a personal name that the Israelites would not write it, they would not say it. And then, Father, Jesus taught us that you are Abba. You are Papa, you are Daddy, and that we can approach you. And not only that, but he made the way for us to approach you, to come into your throne room, to climb up on your lap. And as for some people, as childish or ridiculous as that sounds, that's exactly who you are and what you desire from us, to come to you, to call you Papa. And Father, you are Adonai. You are Lord. You are the Lord over the nations. You are Lord over tyrannies. You are Lord over the empires of the world. You are Lord over dictatorships. You are Lord over democracy. And so, Father, that's what the book of Numbers models, is who you are. You're a God who puts up with us. You're a God who doesn't need us at all, and yet, for some strange reason, you want us. And so, Father, may our desire be given in return. As you have a furious longing for us, Father, may we have a furious longing for you. And that's our prayer tonight, in Jesus' name. Amen.